Thank you, computer voice. Okay, hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. Today we have a quite special, interesting conversation planned here, where if my history is not completely wrong, this year we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Surrealism, and because of that, my friend and comrade Abigail Susik, thanks for coming along, Abigail. Edited 2 issues of the Journal of Avant-Garde Studies on anti-authoritarian politics and surrealism. So, as a part of that, I thought we'd have not a very formal thing, but have a nice sort of discussion of some themes coming out of it. And one of the people who wrote a very excellent piece for this issue is Abigail Löwy. Hope it didn't get it too badly. Thanks for coming along. And so the idea is to have sort of just a general discussion of some of the main ideas coming out of that, particularly this conjunction of surrealism and sort of anti-authoritarian anarchist politics, and also thinking about sort of what that means or could mean to the present, so rather than doing a sort of historiography. So maybe as a place to start, and I'll throw this question out to both of you, is how do you approach questions of sort of approaching surrealism's anti-authoritarian spirit, and how that informs both how you, let's say, understand surrealism historically, but also for today.
Abigail, will you start us off, please? That would be so lovely.
Okay. Well, I would start with just one phrase from Breton's first manifesto, which is the centennial, which really summarized the spirit of the movement since the beginning. Yeah? I say it in French first. Le seul mot de liberté est tout ce qui m'exalte encore. Approximate translation. The single word of freedom is all that still elates me, right? So this gives really, since the beginning, that's something essential in the spirit of surrealism. And this absolute desire of freedom leads to an anti-authoritarian attitude to all kinds of institutions. I would like to mention one more quote by Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin wrote an essay in 1929 about surrealism. And he really understood what surrealism is about, which is not the case with most of his friends from the Frankfurt School, etc., Adorno or Ernst Bloch. They were sympathetic to surrealism, but they didn't understand what it was about. They didn't, but he did. And he has this other phrase, which I like very much. I quote from Benjamin's essay from 1929. Since Bakunin, Europe doesn't have a radical idea of freedom. The surrealists have it. That's it. Yeah, he absolutely summarized in a few words the spirit of surrealism. Yeah, well, which is anti-authoritarian and libertaire. This is a French word which has no translation because libertarian in English is something completely different, which means anti-authoritarian, which includes anarchism, but not only. It's broader. Yeah, it's broader. Libertaire. Now, I'm not going to make a history now of the 100 years. Let's go directly today. Yeah, and I would just say this. Today, we have the most authoritarian regimes all around the world since the end of Second World War. Yeah? At the end of Second World War, we said, never more. Yeah? Fascism, Nazism, authoritarian states, etc., finished. Yeah? But it wasn't finished. And it came back, particularly in the last few years, in our century, 21st, in a terrible form, which is not identical with the fascism of the 30s. This is why I call it neo-fascism, but has a lot in common, and particularly the authoritarian structure of politics under the leader, etc. So this is why more than ever we need this radical idea of freedom, which Europe had lost since Bakunin. We more than ever need this radical idea of freedom to fight against the new forms of fashion. That's what I would say to introduce our conversation.
I think that's a very excellent place to start, in part because one of the dangers, and this comes a lot, particularly when you have events around 100 years or anniversaries of things, you can fall very easily into a kind of historiography and art history that makes it as being a kind of like tracing of styles, right? As if surrealism is just done, finished, and over with, and you just catalog how these things connect to each other. But when you put it as you put it, as this constant search for freedom, a constant search for shared liberty, that's in some ways never over, and it's today not over more than that. I think any of us would like it to be not over, because it's more pressing than ever, right?
Right. Right. Now, let's hear our friends.
Yeah, thank you. This is really helpful. I guess for me, there's something both like practical about trying to find words that allow us to understand something like surrealism's anti-authoritarianism comprehensively, that is on the one hand really just about the problem with semantics, and as we know, words are becoming more and more embattled every day, right? Like, so this question of saying the word libertarian in English is a problem, right? Even the word freedom, especially in an American context, is a problem, right? And how do we think about the history of these words and how they relate to today and how they're being weaponized? So when I hear liberté in French, that immediately makes me think of the French Revolutionary context, which is of course anti-monarchical, but of course it's a totally different set of associations today. So one of the things that I was hoping we could do as a group, and including you, Stephen, with your wonderful essay on sort of e-voucher and the crass community, was to find some words that we could use in common, that we could understand across geographical contexts and across time and space, that would allow us to connect rather than factionalize, or to go back to the, the surrealists rejected communism, in 25, and then they became apolitical. I wanted to set the historical record straight, but also to find a way to communicate with the present in mind. And so for me, as an art historian, for me, the study of surrealism has become more of a question of social movement theory and history, by which we can learn about present day resistance struggles, which are becoming more and more urgent. I mean, every minute, right? That we can learn some lessons about tactical and strategic resistance. And so I wanted there to be a kind of communication between the past and the present that was fluid, but also could stay out of the kind of anthills or infested waters of ideological claiming of words, and this kind of battle over ideas and truth, so to speak, if we can even use that word anymore, or the problem between left and right, we would move away from that. So it was practical desire with a more a kind of crisis underneath it, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. And one thing I would probably add along with that initial formulation of surrealism as the search for freedom is, to me, it seems one of the important moves of early surrealism is addressing dynamics of the unconscious, right? Because this is at an early point where people are just starting to read Freud, understand sort of what our subconscious drives, and how do you think about a politics, not just in terms of conscious choices or decisions, but all these underlying things that drive you on to make decisions you don't necessarily understand. And how do you make art or engage with creativity that it tries to work with that, which is quite difficult.
Another phrase that I highlight in the introduction is Breton phrase from the 1935 Prague speech, where he talks about the hatred of servitude, which is also really helpful because autonomy is there as a word, but it in some ways also doesn't quite talk about the conditions of existence under whatever authoritarian regime. So the hatred of servitude also could speak to the problem of the self, right? This idea of like the inner fascist that maybe Deleuze would have talked about, building on Breton, that the study of the unconscious reveals the individual tendencies toward violence or authoritarianism and the battle within the inside as well, you know? And so that servitude could also refer to the like levels of servitude that we function under in terms of the ego, et cetera. I don't know what Michael would say about that, but the struggle, I think the struggle for surrealism was also starting from the individual, the self.
Well, the surrealists believed in the formidable emancipatory potential of the unconscious, of the free flow of libido, as it expresses itself in poetry, in art, in everything. Yeah. So and dream, above all, dream. So they believed very much that we have to permit our unconscious to be free. Yeah, again we find freedom. Yeah? Let the unconscious be free, and let cancel this terrible authoritarian power of the superego. Yeah, they wouldn't use this terminology, but that was the idea. Yeah? The superego, which is the father of the nation, the dictator or the ruler, etc. So let's get rid of this and let's be free. Let's our libido be free. And here Marquis de Sade was a model figure. Yeah? And so I think they made a very political use of Freud, a very subversive use of Freud, which probably Freud wouldn't agree, but that's the way they interpreted his fantastic discoveries and put them to use in their own artistic and political way.
One of the things I really like about that is the idea that almost access to the unconscious is it easier or automatic? You almost need to explore different sort of tools or methods that help you give freedom to the unconscious play of desires and how you sort of find and play with them rather than just assuming they're just magically there. As a
Yeah, I
kind of
think,
almost experimental practice.
well, that's where in the special issue, your essay on Guy's collage practice and Michael's essay on Michael's essay is called, I'm sorry, I'm calling you Michael again. It's called Poetic Insubordination. So that's actually been the difficult leap, like if from people standing outside of surrealism to say, well, there's surrealism's politics and then surrealism's poetics, but actually there's no separation. And so what you're talking about, Stephen, is the really important question of how, at what point those connect, or what tools we use to help them reconnect in our minds and in our lives, because it's so easy for us to compartmentalize things. We live in a compartmentalized world, right, where alienation is the norm, not just of the worker from their profits, et cetera, and their production, but from on a profoundly interior level. So yeah, I mean, Michael can speak to this because your essay is so deeply about what the lifestyle of the affinity group, the Paris group, has been like, and how that connected with the political practice.
Yes. In surrealism, as you said very aptly, there is no separation. Yeah, there is no separation. It's a holistic approach to life, to art, to politics. Yeah, and a poetry is also the expression of this total desire of freedom, yeah, and politics too, and so on. Yeah, so it is a whole, and there are all kinds of experiences. Yeah, automatic writing, collage, etc. Yeah, games, etc. But these are only one of all kinds of ways and means to permit this free flow of imagination, of desire, of insubmission. Huh? So there is no need to define one of these practices as being the surrealist thing. Yeah? Sometimes Breton, in the early writing, would say automatic writing is surrealism. Yeah? But of course, afterwards he brought this definition. And some of the people, like in the Frankfurt School, like Adorno, would say surrealism is montage. Yeah? It's just one of the techniques of the surrealism. It's not the essence. So I think it's important to see all these techniques and ways and means used by the movement as just one of the many ways to do what is essential, yeah? Which is this free movement of desire, imagination, and insubmission. Steve, so more.
One of the things I really like in these issues, and Abigail, I like how you talk about surrealism in terms of affinity groups, which is interesting because I'm pretty sure it's like historically anachronous, but that doesn't matter because I think it's actually super interesting and accurate, even if it's historically wrong. And there's almost this interesting kind of like weird cartography of that term of how it sort of, comes into English versus, I think through Ben Maria taking it from the Spanish Civil War, and then it being popularized through networks in English and that, and then now using something which again historically doesn't make sense, but to like read that back into a history, but it seems fitting because the affinity group, the small group of intense connections also is the format through which the free play of desire becomes possible and almost like worked with and through. Yeah, so it's just interesting about how something can be historically wrong but poetically very true.
Well, I mean, of course, I'm invested in like unfettering a little bit language, right? And I want to get more precise and allow us to communicate, but also I'm all for anachronism, and surrealism has some of the most creative anachronism I know of, right? Going in all directions, forward and backwards. I love that about surrealism's free play with time and the material remainders of time. But yeah, the affinity thing group, my use of that term and introduction and in general, when I think about surrealism, is a way also to kind of try to distance us a little bit from 100 years of scholarship, like academic scholarship on surrealism that would refer to it as an avant-garde, or just another, sort of in the succession of movements, Cubism, Dada, etc., that, then die out before World War II. Or, if they still exist, they're an embarrassment after World War II, to align surrealism more with emancipation movements rather than art, right? Because even the problem of art is, and not just a question of anti-art per se, as Dada might have it, but on the whole, art would be part of the capitalist structure, right? So yes, affinity group came from Ben Maria, and really what I wanted to do was sort of say, how could studying the quote unquote new left, and I'm not so crazy about that title. I have problems with the left and the right, which also go back to the French Revolution. Did you know that the left and the right, those words refer to sitting on either side of the National Assembly. And so if you're on the right, you're a royalist essentially. And the farther left you go, the farther you are away from the notion of a centrist idea. I guess that's probably obvious, but I think it's important we're conscious of the legacies of these words. But the affinity group has Ben Morea, who is an American ultra-leftist radical, mostly anarchist. I think he would probably even avoid kind of that identification, right, starting in the 60s and still working today. For him, describes a group that is so intimate they would die for one another in the struggle. And so that's why the Spanish Revolution is really important for him. Now, that doesn't quite describe a surrealist dynamic, right? The surrealists aren't working in a militant context exactly. Some of them did. Obviously, Benjamin Pérez joined the Spanish Revolution and took up arms. And there are a few other cases of militant or incarcerated race traders. Marilyn Buck fascinates me. She's not well known today, but was a militant incarcerated American surrealist. But the group has to be intimate and share ideas and ideals in a certain way that would then allow them to be cohesive enough and see each other literally like every day or every week, that then they could work together, in solidarity, in a communal sense, on that struggle against internal and external authoritarianism. So yeah, I am totally fine adopting that that anachronistic word and others to try to help us break away from this, monolithic art historical reception of surrealism. I would love to hear what Michael would say about this affinity group term, and it's using that for surrealist groups.
Yeah, well, I think it was a very helpful, even I would say brilliant insight to use the concept of affinity group, which came from the Spanish anarchists, to describe the way the surrealist group functioned. Yeah, you are absolutely right to say that the concept of avant-garde and either political or artistic avant-garde is not useful. Yeah, well, we wrote our articles for avant-garde studies, but between us, the surrealists never wanted to be an avant-garde group, right? It absolutely refuses this etiquette, this concept. Yeah. So it's not an artistic avant-garde. It's not a political group like the various political parties or grouplets which exist in the left, etc. It's something else, something new, something different. Yeah. And I think the concept of group of affinity captures this. Yeah, I like also the concept of elective affinity. What is elective affinity? It's a term which has a history. It comes from alchemy. Yeah? The alchemists described elements which could come together because they attracted each other by their affinity. They elected each other, elective affinity. And from chemistry, it came then, it moved to literature because Goethe wrote this book, the Wahlverwandtschaften, the elective affinities, where he moved from chemistry to sentiment, to love. Love is an affair of elective affinity between the man and the woman. Yeah? So I think one could say that the surrealist group was based on is an affinity group or an elective affinity group. Yeah, I think one can say this, but again, it's a very specific form, which of course are not identical with those of the anarchist movements in Spain, etc. But I think it captures some of the way people relate them one to the other in the surrealist group.
Part of why I think that's so useful is if you're talking about surrealism, which is, again, as you say, not a party, not an avant-garde. And one of the things most interesting about it is not necessarily how this surrealist group gives way to this surrealist, like gives this, whole chain of like groups which are all defined as particularly surrealist, but you have these kind of affinities and influences which emerge, which aren't only within surrealist groups. So for instance, in the essay I wrote, for instance, like G. Voucher, but as a member of Crass, as part of punk, as part of this artistic milieu, would probably never refer to herself as a surrealist. But if you look at her work, there's lots of ways which she engages with surrealist artists, uses similar ideas, draws from that history, and uses it in different ways. And again, it's the kind of elective affinity. Um, and if you're only looking at sort of straight influence and genealogies of formally organized groups, whether parties or organizations, you can miss out a lot of those affinities, those influences, those patterns, which I think is actually what some of the most interesting stories are.
Right.
They're a lot messier, but
Michael, you're the perfect person to talk about this because in a way, there's this sort of in art history, there's a kind of reflection, a dual reflection on the art side. You have the pre-war avant-gardes and then the quote unquote neo-avant-gardes after the war. But on the political spectrum, you have the old left, right? And then the new left, the quote unquote new left. And it's so artificial in a way, but I think I've been way more inspired by thinking about the quote unquote new left, looking back to, interwar or even before that, political initiatives or anti-statist initiatives, et cetera, that were really useful to them. And so what happens if you put like contemporary surrealists, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, looking back to earlier surrealists around the world next to that kind of political, retrospectivity in a sense, right? Like you were both of those things. You were connected to the student movement to some degree and also, deeply invested in a pre-war surrealism. And I think that there's just like brilliant fireworks there to be discovered of what that your generation experienced, what you found in surrealism, even while you were part of the broader struggle at that time in the 60s and 70s. So there's so many stories there, as Stephen said, of affinity and of connection.
I didn't get what was your question.
Well, I guess I'm asking about like you as a young person in France, and well, when obviously you have a Brazilian background, but like what about surrealism spoke to you in terms of your own political formation in the 60s and 70s?
Okay. Now, in fact, I'm a very old person. And I discovered surrealism in the 50s, well before you were born. And I discovered the surrealism around, I don't know, 56 or 57, in Brazil, where there didn't exist any surrealist movement. And just by reading a few pieces, and among the pieces that had a very strong impact on me, because I was a political activist already at age 16, 17, there was this manifesto for a revolutionary independent art, Trotsky and Breton, yes, 1938, which said, among other things, that we need in an anarchist regime in artistic activity, no authority of the state, of the party, or of anything else. So I was very much, it was a real discovery. It was an extraordinary discovery, this text, and at the same time also Breton's writings and etc. But the first thing was this manifesto, and my first piece, which I wrote in 1959 when I was 20 years old or something like that, was an essay for the 20th anniversary of the manifesto, or 30th anniversary of the manifesto, 38 to 50, no, 20th anniversary, 50. Yeah. So, this was the beginning, but I didn't connect to I was in Brazil. Yeah. And then when I came to France in the 70s, etc., it took me some time to discover the Surrealist group. So I really joined the movement much later, yeah, in 1975. So although I had been interested and I had been reading, etc., about Surrealism since 1958, it's only much later in 1975 that I discovered the group, and thanks to Vincent Bonnour, I joined the Surrealist movement. So that's to make a long story short, okay? And I had, at the same time, I always had a political activity since Brazil. Yeah? My basic reference was always Rosa Luxemburg. Then came others, Che Guevara, Trotsky, you name it. Yeah? But the kind of basic politics for me always was, till today, it's Rosa Luxemburg. But I've always been politically active. And this, of course, had some relation to Surrealism, but it was not a direct relation. It was not that I tried to bring my political views into the Surrealist movement or vice versa. It was something which was, to some extent, kept separate. As with Benjamin Perret, yeah, he has also had a political activity, but he didn't impose it on the Surrealist group. Yeah. By the way, I had the chance of meeting Benjamin Perret in 1958 when I came to visit Paris as a tourist. And we had long conversations about the Spanish Revolution. And he told me that after some hesitation, he decided that the only revolutionary movement in Spain was the Columna Durruti, yeah? The Durruti column, yeah? So he joined them, yeah? Although he wasn't an anarchist, but these were the people, yeah? The real revolutionary people. Okay, that's it.
I just want to put this out there. There's this like mythic photo of Perret that is described by, actually, I forget who right now. I think I've asked you about this, Michael, of Benjamin Perret holding a rifle and petting a cat while at the Spanish Revolution. We have a verbal description of it, but no one can find the actual photograph. If anybody finds that photograph, let us know right away. I can see it in my mind, but it's just my mind constructing the fantasy of the image, But I'd really like to have that photo.
But the most important question is, what was the cat's name?
Totally.
Dali.
Right. I mean, that's just that kind of like describes what you were talking about, like the caress of the animal on one hand and the rifle in the other. There's this kind of it's not a split like what you were just saying between your political and your poetic side, your surrealist side and your activist side, and yet there may be two arms of the same creature.
Yeah. If we don't find the photo, we have to make it. Make a collage.
Yeah, I've done a really bad drawing. You don't want to see it. It's
I want to see it, please.
so bad.
But one of the things I really love about sort of how surrealism circulates around the world to you in Brazil, to our friends in Chicago, is it's taken up by people who find different arms of the cat, right? And find ways to connect it to what's happening in where they are, whether it's a civil rights struggle, whether it's an authoritarian government, whether it's trying to, it doesn't mean just one thing. It sort of moves, it mutates as it moves around. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it. It'd be a lot less interesting if it was just like, oh no, it's just the cat. It's just one thing.
No, it's true that surrealism has been able to take very different forms in France, in England, in the United States, etc. I'm very full of admiration and enthusiasm for the experience of the Chicago Surrealist group, yeah, of the Rosemonts. I admire these people very much by their political commitment with the IWW and with the student movement in the 60s and everything else. And also the whole way they imagined their political surrealist activity against racism and the artistic and intellectual productivity, creativity of the Chicago group is something which really astonished me, yeah? Which is very different from the Paris group, although they were absolutely faithful to Breton's message, yes, and to the surrealist philosophy, but they produced something very peculiar to the American culture, popular culture, to the American revolutionary traditions, etc. So I think this is a beautiful example of how surrealism, being something shared by people all around the world on some essential principles which were formulated by Breton, can take very different forms in different societies.
I completely agree. I mean, it's the same search for the marvelous, but it's finding the marvelous in crazy cat cartoons, comic books, jazz, and blues. And it's a similar spirit, but just finding that somewhere else, somewhere where you might not expect it as much.
And by the way, the surrealists were in Chicago were great admirers of jazz, and they have written a lot on jazz. And there is a kind of some kind of elective affinity between jazz and surrealism.
This is why I always kind of wondered if surrealism actually referred to itself, maybe you know, Michael, as the Surrealist International. So before the Situationist International, did surrealists ever refer to themselves as an SI? You know, because in that sense that like reflected socialism, you know, the history of socialism as a political movement. I never knew if that was the case. We say international surrealism, but we always avoid Surrealist International. So because that's one of the like, it's like a trick. How do you talk about surrealism as a whole when it's so distinct in all of its groups? And then even within the groups, you have people with autonomous political affiliations, and so you have to be really careful to not generalize and to permit that autonomy and see the variance within the affinity, you know, and like that's part of the sort of trick of talking about it as a whole. Or there's this sort of silly debate in academia lately, like maybe the last 10 years, where you say, is it one surrealism or do we say it's many surrealisms? And but people have taken that really seriously, and I'm not trying to, I guess I think it's silly because in the end, that's not the main question for me. But if you do think it's important, I respect that. But you know, I'm more interested in like how surrealism can help us with some of these urgent problems we have. So anyway, more about semantics. It always comes in. How do we get away from it?
Well, first, we need to have a dialectical approach. You know, the surrealists admired Hegel's dialectic very much. So surrealism is absolutely one, yeah? It's one movement sharing a common way of thinking and acting, and it's completely different in the various countries. Huh? It's both, absolutely both. Huh? Now, the Surrealist International, during Breton's time, there was a kind of centrality of Paris because of Breton. Yeah, so Paris was a kind of center, and around Paris there were peripheries. Yeah, but I wouldn't say this was an international. Yeah, although it had some character. Now, later, after Breton's death, slowly began to emerge something where there was no more a center like Paris used to be. So something like a Surrealist International started to emerge with, for instance, international surrealist meetings. When Chicago organized a Surrealist International exhibition, people came from different countries. There was also a international surrealist exhibition in Prague in the 90s on the topic of blasphemy. And at some moment there was an international surrealist bulletin in the 90s. And in 94 came an international surrealist statement against the so-called discovery of the Americas. So this was a statement signed by surrealist groups all around the world, in United States, Latin America, Europe, etc. So these were the main manifestations. I don't know if today there still exists Surrealist International. There are contacts, there are discussions, but I don't see something emerge like it did in the 90s. That's it.
One thing which I really love, and again, I'm still with Franklin and Penelope here, is I really love the book that I think Franklin put together with Robin D.J. Kelly. What was it called? Black, Brown, and Beige, where he was tracing out, or they were tracing out those sort of influences of surrealism across Africa, across the Caribbean, of all these areas in which wouldn't be given as much or any visibility if you're just focused on, for instance, on just Paris. I mean, nothing against Paris. It's a very nice place, of course. But there's something lost when you only focus on the center and ignore what's happening in all the peripheries and all these things that are circulating, elsewhere.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And unfortunately, for long, historians of surrealism spoke exclusively of the Paris group. Exhibitions of art focused almost exclusively on French or Belgian surrealist artists. But this is beginning to change, fortunately. And there was an exhibition 2 or 3 years ago, I don't remember, in London, I don't forget the name, which really showed this international nature of the surrealist movement, and show how in all kinds of countries there were a very interesting surrealist experience and art, etc. So I think this has changed. We have been able to overcome this Paris-centric approach. And of course, books like those of Franklin and Robin Kelly helped very much to broaden our understanding of surrealism. By the way, Robin Kelly is someone which is a really interesting figure. I had the chance of meeting him, and he really brings to the surrealist movement the whole experience of Black American culture, jazz, Black liberation movement, and this gives a very powerful inspiration to the surrealist movement in the United States.
He's amazing. And when there's also a forthcoming special issue of African American Review on Black surrealisms that I did with my best friend, who is a French scholar of the Caribbean and Black studies. And Robin has a new essay. It's coming out very soon. That sort of connects all of that. And Robin is also a Marxist with a very, very deep roots in in all of the phases of Marxism. And so this essay it sort of does all of those things. It is talking about, what for him it's almost like an orthodox Marxism in an unorthodox way, if you will. And, he's very schooled in that, and brings that all together in a way that seems so relevant for this moment. And maybe kind of reflects kind of the current rise of different socialist political figures right now. So as we see the rise of authoritarian or neo-fascist leaders on an international basis, we are seeing some emergence of socialist parties or leaders. So I think I really recommend that essay when it comes out. And he's just, for me, Michael Key, in that way that he is, I don't know if Robin would describe himself as a surrealist, but again, having all those arms. He has the cat arms, he has the Marxist arms, he has the surrealist, he's a dialectical in the most wonderful sense.
When we met, he described himself as a Marxist, a surrealist, and a feminist. So you have all
That's
these
great.
3 cats and the gun.
And as you know, it's very difficult to herd cats, so they probably don't always get along. But you know, I remember one of my favorite parts of Freedom Dreams, which was this amazing book, is this little story he tells of he's at some like socialist meeting, and like he gets into an argument with some comrades who are telling him he has to only like sort of like Phil Oakes style folk music. And he's like, no, 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 I want Bootsy Collins. We need the funk. And it's the same kind of like drive to find the eruption of desire, eruption of the marvelous in all kinds of cultural formations and Black culture and the history of music, and not just whatever is deemed to be appropriate by comrades or the market or art institutions for that matter.
Right.
I'm really interested in those stories of people who don't easily fit the surrealist model, if there is one, and I hate to say that, who are kind of, I mean, I guess I'm just interested in outliers in general in my life, but that I think in those sort of exceptions, there are stories that are really important, like David Roediger, who is a world famous scholar of race studies, in particular of critical whiteness studies, has deep roots in American surrealism. And it's just like, I mean, he writes about it in his recent memoir, but it's not well known, I don't think, or how those things might connect. And in some ways, by looking at individual praxes of surrealism with the other things, you can find how they, how these formations or I think praxis is a good word, actually, how it all fits together. And I many people here today can speak very clearly to how that praxis plays out for them in their daily lives. And more lately now, going ahead, we might have to really confront that even more clearly, how they fit together or how they don't, in order to survive, et cetera, or, who knows what's coming with society now. So it could become a really urgent question.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned David Rediger, because this issue of anti-racism was so important for the surrealists, and this is why there was an elective affinity with David Rediger. And the surrealists published 2 issues of a journal in America called Race Traitor. All right, exactly. Because, let me see what's written here. Surrealism Revolution Against Whiteness. Yeah. And the title of the journal says, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity, or something like that. Right? So, Race Traitor, there were 2 issues, and one many years ago, and another one with Ron Sikorski, this anarchist surrealist Canadian fellow. So, and this is how David Rediger is really part of the surrealist spirit in the United States. Yeah.
Go, Stephen. I know you have a question. Yeah. I can
No,
see the question for the cat coming out of your head here.
well, what I was actually thinking about is at a certain point we should perhaps also open the conversation a little bit and bring other people in. But I was trying to think of the best way to touch other cats' paws and see who wants to do some scratching. Yeah. Okay, well, With that thought, now that I've let it out of the bag, let's see who wants to bring something in. Anna?
Hi, thank you guys for a great talk. I did have a question that I think is kind of it could be one of those things that's a big discourse, but I think that it is the initial point in my own thinking process behind this. I was wondering if we could return to your discussion on surrealism not being avant-garde, its rejection of it. And, you started by talking about the history of words, which is one of my favorite subjects personally. And I was wondering if, with this term avant-garde and its history and its meaning, were the surrealists trying to reject militancy, a sense of futurism or what the future means, Dadaism, Leninism, all of the above, this term avant-garde in relation to surrealism. What is the connection and what is the rejection?
Mhm. Well, I don't know if the surrealists ever wrote something more systematic about this, but I know that there is a kind of epidermic rejection of the term avant-garde. The surrealist movement doesn't see itself as an avant-garde. First, certainly not as an artistic avant-garde, because it was something very different in nature from cubism, fauvism, futurism, etc., you name it. Yeah. So it was something radically different because it didn't want to be just a new form of artistic practice. Yeah? And it had a much larger ambitions. Yeah, as I said, surrealism is a revolutionary attempt to re-enchant the world, which of course includes art, but it's not an artistic group or artistic avant-garde. So this concept of artistic avant-garde for the surrealists it's like close them into interwar. I don't know if you say in English, a drawer inside the drawer.
Do you mind, can I follow up on that? I think, you mentioned this idea of the new. So, of course, the term avant-garde, it is very much about novelty, right? And then
Yes,
you say that's part of the rejection. And then there's this idea of the re-enchantment. And it means it kind of again. So would you say that there's something kind of more historicist about surrealism?
absolutely, absolutely. I think surrealism is to a large extent a romantic revolutionary movement. What means romantic? It's a protest against modern bourgeois, industrial, capitalist, Western civilization in the name of certain past values, pre-modern, yeah, which can be magic, analogic thinking, alchemy, etc. Yeah, indigenous cultures around the world, etc., etc. So this idea that before capitalism arrived and transformed everything into commodities, there existed social, cultural, spiritual, human values which are now being destroyed. Yeah? So this idea of the value of the past, yeah, is very strong in surrealism. Yeah? You find this in all the writings and etc. etc. Just take the example of alchemy. It's so important in the history of surrealism, the relation to alchemy. And it's certainly not something modern or avant-garde. Yeah? Okay, so this makes already a clear distinction between surrealism and avant-garde movements. And it's not that surrealism was hostile to the avant-garde movement. They could have sympathies with some of them. With Dadaism, of course, they had sympathies. They were part of it at the beginning. But what they wanted something else. Yeah? What they wanted something else. And they didn't like the concept, they didn't consider themselves as a political avant-garde. Yeah? The Leninists used the idea of the party, the vanguard party. Yeah? So the surrealists could, for some time, had sympathies for the communist movement, but they didn't consider themselves as part as being a political avant-garde, a leadership, etc. No, that was not at all their view. And in general, the idea of avant-garde is someone which is going in front, and the others have to follow him. Yeah, that means avant-garde literally. Yeah, so the part of the troop which goes in front and the others follow. And if something which the Surrealists did not want is to have many followers. Yeah, they didn't want to have followers. Yeah? So the whole concept of avant-garde was completely alien to the spirit of Surrealism.
Thank
I
you.
think.
Just say briefly to add on to what Michael said very clearly there, that thinking was also part of the background of anti-authoritarian as a concept that might make us be able to tell with both more accuracy, but also more capaciousness, the sort of history of surrealist of struggle against oppression, or as the beautiful word Michael has been using is in submission, was this question of the vanguard, because that also becomes key in the New Left in the 60s, right? I mean, you still have some vanguardist ideas floating around, but then, like, for instance, with Maria and groups like that, there's a rejection of any party formation or organization or any kind of vertical hierarchy in favor of the horizontality or rhizomatic structure of an affinity group. Maria describes it as a concentric circle, so the closest few members of the affinity group, and then sort of the circles that come out from that. And it's really interesting what you said about followers, Michael, because I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, we use the word movement, but surrealist movement, but it's interesting to think about that distinction, but that there's no delivery of the ideology or the directive or even the strategy from the small vanguard, secretive, small, hermetic, closed vanguard to the masses, but actually that the surrealist affinity group is taking from the popular, drawing on the energies of the popular to thrive, if that makes sense. So the clear rejection of vanguardism would be part of that, what I might call far left orientation. Then there's a long Marxist history there, of left communism with Rosa Luxemburg rejecting, right, the party structure, interested in spontaneous revolution, and then like Bordiga in Italy, and you could follow that whole line of the critique of vanguardism in Marxist history too. It's quite interesting to do that.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And I think it also shows you a certain sort of almost like unfortunate end state that many avant-gardes get into. Here, like thinking of like how the situation is end, where like after Debord has managed to purge everyone else, and it's like two guys like left somewhere sitting by themselves, and then they had to like break with each other, right? And that's not an entirely or very, very, let's just say that's not the best way to go about things.
I mean, I want to say, and I mentioned this in the introduction to the Journal of Avant-Garde Studies, which, by the way, we were like, okay, we're like talking about surrealism as a non-avant-garde for this journal called Avant-Garde Studies. We knew that there was some tension there, but like there, I think it's important to recognize that I believe that surrealism did envision a time in which it would no longer be needed, and that's a future time when capitalism has been abolished, perhaps, or there's another way of living, so that its relevance, or it could be become outmoded. I don't know if that's the best word, but I don't think that there was ever an idea that surrealism should last forever, and but that actually that it's there for us when it's needed, and it could pop up again, it could go back down, right? It's a sort of force that moves through time in a non-linear way.
I wonder.
Well, if Marx has his old mole, surrealism can have it sort of like somewhat difficult standoffish cat.
A zombie cat.
I mean, I guess you could say, based on the title and then the interpretation, that surrealism is in dialectic with the avant-garde. maybe similar to how anti-art in Dada was a dialectic with art. I guess. I don't know.
Makes sense.
Well, that's what I like that affinity group term, because it is an explicit critique of the avant-garde in both the political and artistic sense. So they certainly were in tension with like modernism as such. They just don't fit that narrative very well. So no matter how much we try to put them back in there, sweep them, into the timeline. So dialectic is just a wonderful reminder, Michael, that it doesn't have to fit perfectly. It's and that it we can have the opposites within the paradigm.
But I think what's interesting about it, and I kind of sort of making the same point again, but like when you get outside of the paradigm of avant-garde, then you can see all kinds of influences that go beyond sort of like who made that very famous chart within is it Alfred Barr, who makes these very sort of like nice sort of like genealogical map of sort of various art movements and how they all flow very neatly. But what I think is more interesting is almost like the sort of the messy influences, the things they take it up in weird ways, and what they produce.
That's the alchemy. That's the weird alchemy, the mixing of things that produce this totally unique, idiosyncratic, like, do you know that word, like symphonic? I love it. It's like refers to like things coming from the ground where you are, like this kind of uber local vibe. Yeah, you can take the subject matter, and then you transmute it into something else that's specific to place and time.
Yeah. So not to sort of rain on the parade, because this is super fun and I'm really enjoying it, but maybe we should at some point sort of start nudging to a not a conclusion, but a sort of a pausing point for the evening. And maybe we could take that as a sort of inspiration and think about what ways might we draw on these histories to now think about what, how we're responding to the present moment, which sometimes I don't want to think about it at all, because it constantly feels like things just keep getting more and more horrible. But like, what of these histories and practices and stories sort of can be, not necessarily for everyone, but do you want to draw from and thinking about how to respond to the present? Either or any of you can go with that one.
Yeah, I'd
Well,
love to hear from other people.
I think that if I
Yes.
can speak, I think that what I take from it is that, oh, it's an old line, we are many, they are few. And that in the history of surrealism, there are so many people that have questioned, the existing paradigm, and that it's not over. We can still win. It's what I take from the surrealist tradition is hope, really. There are so many other ways that we could live.
Definitely.
That's it.
No.
No, I think there are two things in surrealism which are relevant today. One is the absolute rejection of authoritarian powers, be it religious, political, patriarchal, etc. The absolute rejection of the Western capitalist civilization. And the absolute rejection of all forms of fascism, including, of course, the neo-fascism of today. Yeah? So this insubmissive tradition of surrealism is more than ever relevant, because, as I said at the beginning, we never had so many authoritarian regimes in the world. It's like if Le Père Ubu from Jarry came back to life, yes, with a pre-surrealist figure, right? But at the same time, the surrealists had a strong empathy to all subversive movements, all movements of rebellion, all movements which try to challenge this power. Yeah? So this is why they supported the anti-colonial movements, the Spanish Revolution, and more recently the Zapatista movement in Mexico, yes, and so on, and the black and insurrections in the United States. So I think this is the more positive side of the Surrealism, this strong identification with the subversive, insurrectional, insubmissive movements all around the world. And this is, again, very, very, very something which we very, very much need today.
So more and more, I'm interested in insurrectionists, surrealists, the examples that we have of surrealists who were militant or were considered dangerous and militant, even if they didn't take up arms. And there are some examples I was just learning about through the Surrealism Beyond Borders catalog, actually, the exhibition you mentioned, Michael. There's an artist named Haifa Zangana, who is a Kurdish Iraqi artist and writer. She's, I think, mostly known as a writer now, who has a collage in there called The Destruction of the Map. But Haifa was in the 70s, mid-70s, as a very young woman, arrested by what was essentially Saddam Hussein's government for passing out communist literature, and then imprisoned and tortured with other colleagues or comrades, and got released because I think a cousin was a bodyguard of Saddam's, and she moved elsewhere. And I don't actually know deeply what her connection to surrealism is, but I wonder if there'll be like a test moment ahead in which there needs to be a new branch of insurrectionary surrealism as abuse of power grows and fascism spreads like wildfire, how that will change surrealism, and what we really might begin to see, on a more widespread level, people say, oh, surrealism is not an art form, but it is a praxis of rebellion and resistance. I don't know. I mean, I hope we don't see the surrealist affinity groups or cadres becoming, embattled in that way. But I don't know really what the future holds. So I don't want to end on a down note. But I'm pretty freaked out lately. So my understanding of surrealism is changing as things are changing now.
Well, what we can do then, maybe this is what I thought to end on, is when authoritarian agents come for us, we'll say, oh, no, we're just doing surrealist art history. It's not an insurrection, it's just a little bit of art history.
Harmless, yeah. I mean, I think that's important to begin to think about, like, what's a front for, other kinds of, what is a way of defense or of concealment. I think that's very interesting.
Now, you mentioned this Iraqi artist, and during the first Gulf War, the Surrealists in Paris issued a tract with her drawing and a text, which was an ultimatum to George Bush. Yeah, you must resign, otherwise the Surrealists will deal with you. Yeah, and this tract was very successful, and Le Monde, the daily newspaper, published it. Yeah, so it was quite successful. So we must react. We must react to what's going on in the world. We cannot stay indifferent but the political activists have their own ways to react, of course, but surrealism has a different way, and surrealism has its word to say about everything, which is going on, of course.
Excellent. Well, maybe we can pause there, and I will thank everyone who's come along and joined the conversation. I think it's been super interesting. And thank you to Michael, and to Abigail for coming along, and everyone else as well.
And thank you for organizing the whole thing.
Yeah.
So great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just thanks, Stephen, and everybody. It's just really great to be with you. It means a lot to me.
Thank
Here
you.
in the United States, it's Labor Day, which is like a fake May Day. So it's just great to connect with you.
Oh, good.